You were taught this from the moment you became a man. Endure. Be patient. Hold the line. When things get hard, give more. When love hurts, you don't question it, you man up. You absorb the damage quietly and tell yourself that suffering is part of the deal, that if you can just endure long enough, your loyalty will be rewarded. Your pain will mean something. Your sacrifice will make you virtuous. And that belief has destroyed more men than betrayal ever could. Because no one ever taught you discernment. No one ever told you that sacrifice is not automatically noble. That giving more does not make you stronger when it's given to the wrong person. You were trained to associate pain with purpose, endurance with worth, and self-erasure with love. So when the relationship destabilizes, you don't step back, you lean in. You try harder. You tolerate more. You convince yourself that real men don't walk away. They bleed quietly and call it commitment. But here's the truth that cuts through all of that conditioning. Sacrifice doesn't make you noble if it's misplaced. It makes you useful. And usefulness is not the same as being valued. The most dangerous lie men believe is that suffering automatically makes them worthy. It doesn't. It only proves how much you're willing to lose without asking whether the loss is justified. There are women who meet sacrifice with gratitude and reciprocity. And there are women who consume it without conscience, because you taught them they could. If that sentence makes you uncomfortable, good. It means you're starting to see the lie you were raised on. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. You didn't start over-sacrificing because you're weak. You started because you were trained to measure your value through usefulness. From an early age, you learned that love isn't given freely to men. It's earned through effort, through reliability, through carrying weight without complaint. Endurance was framed as masculinity, not as a warning sign. So when something hurts, you don't interpret it as information. You interpret it as a test. And tests are meant to be passed, not questioned. This conditioning runs deeper than romance. Men are rewarded socially for being useful, not for being fulfilled. You matter when you provide. You're respected when you endure. You're praised when you absorb pressure and keep functioning. So when you enter relationships, that same framework follows you. You believe that if you give enough, tolerate enough, adjust enough, the bond will eventually stabilize. That love is something you secure through persistence. You weren't taught to choose wisely. You were taught to endure blindly. That's why men stay too long. Not because they're stupid or desperate, but because leaving feels like failure. Walking away feels like weakness. You rationalize disrespect because acknowledging it would force you to admit that endurance isn't always strength. You explain away crossed boundaries as stress, confusion, temporary phases. You convince yourself that tolerance makes you mature, when in reality, it's slowly teaching someone how little they need to give back to keep you. This is where the trap closes. The more you endure, the more your identity becomes tied to enduring. Sacrifice turns into proof of character instead of a conscious choice. And once that happens, discernment disappears. You stop asking whether the relationship is reciprocal and start asking how much more you can survive. Strength gets confused with silence. Loyalty gets confused with self-neglect. This matters because over-sacrifice doesn't create respect, it erodes it. Not just from her, but from yourself. And the moment you confuse tolerance with strength, you hand your power to anyone willing to take advantage of it. The conditioning that made you reliable is the same conditioning that keeps you stuck. And until you see that clearly, you'll keep calling endurance love even when it's slowly costing you everything. There's a distinction most men are never taught to make, and confusing it quietly ruins their lives. Investment and sacrifice feel similar on the surface because both cost effort, but they operate on opposite psychological rules. Investment grows value. It compounds. It builds something that eventually feeds back into you. Sacrifice, when it isn't reciprocated, drains identity. It takes without replenishing. And men who don't separate these two end up bleeding themselves dry while calling it love. Investment has return. When you invest, your effort is met with effort. Your time deepens connection. Your presence increases mutual respect. There's friction, but it's productive. Growth happens on both sides. Sacrifice only makes sense when it's reciprocated. When your giving is met with care, accountability, and restraint. The moment sacrifice becomes one-directional, it stops being virtuous and starts being corrosive. And this shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, disguised as commitment. The earliest red flag is subtle, but unmistakable. Once you know how to see it when sacrifice becomes expected, not appreciated, when what you give is treated as baseline instead of gift, when your flexibility becomes entitlement, when your patience is assumed, not respected, you stop being thanked and start being relied upon. And reliance without respect is extraction. At that point, every additional sacrifice doesn't strengthen the bond. It teaches her that your limits are negotiable and your needs are optional. Men struggle here because sacrifice feels masculine. Walking away feels selfish. You tell yourself that real men don't keep score, that love isn't transactional. But discernment isn't transaction. It's self-respect. You're not counting points, you're observing balance. Investment doesn't require martyrdom. Sacrifice does. And martyrdom never builds attraction or loyalty. It builds dependence on your erosion. This is where identity starts leaking. You shrink your standards to maintain peace. You tolerate things you wouldn't advise another man to accept. You tell yourself it's temporary, that things will stabilize once you give a little more. But value doesn't emerge from depletion. It collapses. And the more you sacrifice without return, the harder it becomes to stop, because now stopping would mean admitting you gave too much to the wrong place. Understanding this distinction changes everything. It doesn't make you cold. It makes you precise. You stop confusing endurance with devotion. You stop offering your spine as proof of love. Because once sacrifice replaces investment, the relationship isn't growing anymore. It's consuming you. And no one who consumes you is entitled to what it costs to keep you standing. This is where men make the mistake of turning clarity into cruelty. They want a list of villains, a moral judgment, someone to blame. But this isn't about good women versus bad women. It's about patterns, behavior, not character. Because the women who are not worth your sacrifice don't announce themselves as malicious. They reveal themselves through imbalance. Watch what happens as your effort increases. If her accountability decreases at the same time, pay attention. When you step up, do more, carry more. But she apologizes less, reflects less, adjusts less. That's not growth. That's entitlement forming. When your boundaries shrink to keep the peace while her expectations quietly expand. The relationship isn't becoming more loving, it's becoming asymmetrical. And asymmetry is where respect begins to erode. Another pattern men ignore because it feels selfish to name it, whose emotions are allowed to matter. If your pain is minimized, reframed, or treated as inconvenience, while her emotions dictate the emotional climate of the relationship, something is wrong. Not because her feelings don't matter, but because yours apparently don't. Sacrifice turns toxic the moment empathy becomes one-directional. And that shift is gradual enough that most men adapt to it instead of confronting it. The clearest signal comes last, and it's the hardest to accept. When your sacrifices are treated as baseline, not gift. When what once earned appreciation becomes the minimum requirement to stay relevant. You're no longer chosen, you're utilized. And utilization feels stable until you stop providing. That's when the truth surfaces. Here's the line that cuts through all the confusion if you're brave enough to hold it. If your absence would hurt her more than your presence. She values you. If not, she values what you provide. That distinction isn't cruel. It's clarifying. Love responds to loss. Convenience replaces quickly. Men stay stuck here because they don't want to believe they've been reduced to function. They double down, hoping more sacrifice will restore value. It never does. It only deepens the pattern. The women who aren't worth your sacrifice aren't evil. They're simply comfortable benefiting from your erosion. And the moment you recognize that, the question isn't whether you're strong enough to endure, it's whether you're strong enough to stop. Smart men don't stay because they don't see the problem. They stay because their ego turns the problem into a test of character. The sunk cost fallacy does most of the work. Years invested, energy spent, sacrifices already made. Walking away doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like erasing proof that all of it meant something. So instead of asking whether the relationship still has value, you ask how much more you can endure without breaking. You don't want to lose the future, but what you're really protecting is the past. Identity attachment tightens the trap. You tell yourself, I'm not the guy who quits. You've built an image of yourself as reliable, steady, the one who stays when things get hard. Leaving would shatter that self-concept. It would force you to confront the idea that endurance isn't always noble and that terrifies men who've built their pride on resilience. So you keep going, even when going costs you respect. Even when staying requires you to betray your own standards. Fear of starting over seals it. The unknown feels heavier than the known. Even when the known is quietly killing you. You imagine the effort of rebuilding, the vulnerability of beginning again, the possibility that you'll fail differently next time. And that fear gets dressed up as loyalty, as commitment, as patience. Hope steps in and wears the mask of virtue. You tell yourself things will change if you just hold on a little longer, if you give a little more, if you prove once again that you're willing to sacrifice. Here's the hard line men avoid, because it exposes everything at once. Staying isn't strength. When leaving requires courage. Endurance is easy when it spares you from facing loss, uncertainty, and the risk of redefining yourself. Courage is choosing dignity over familiarity. Courage is admitting that effort doesn't entitle you to return. And the longer you stay trapped in ego, the more you confuse suffering with loyalty until you no longer remember who you were before enduring became your identity. Misplaced sacrifice doesn't explode. It corrodes, slowly enough that you adapt to the damage instead of stopping it. At first, it looks like maturity. You swallow irritation. You let things slide. You tell yourself you're choosing peace. But over time, something essential shifts. Desire turns into obligation. Affection becomes duty. And resentment starts leaking into places you never intended it to reach. Not loud resentment, quiet resentment. The kind that hardens your tone, drains your energy, and makes your presence feel heavier than it used to. As this continues, self-respect erodes without ceremony. You don't wake up one day feeling small. You just stop defending things that once mattered to you. You compromise values to avoid conflict. You tolerate treatment you'd never accept from anyone else. And every time you do, you send a message not just to her, but to yourself, that your boundaries are flexible when pressure is applied. That message compounds. Slowly, you become easier to overlook because you've trained the relationship to function without regard for your limits. Attraction doesn't survive this process, not because sacrifice is unattractive in itself, but because self-erasure is. Attraction requires tension, polarity, a sense that the man in front of her is choosing to stay not trapped by fear, guilt, or habit. When you sacrifice your spine to keep her comfortable, you remove the very structure that made you compelling. You become predictable, safe in the worst way, invisible. And invisibility is the final consequence most men never see coming. Here's the brutal truth men avoid because it stings. No woman respects a man who sacrifices his spine to keep her comfortable. She may rely on him. She may benefit from him. She may even fear losing what he provides. But respect, the kind that fuels desire and reciprocity, doesn't coexist with self-abandonment. You can't be admired for erasing yourself, no matter how noble the intention feels. By the time this becomes obvious, the damage is already done. You feel unseen in a relationship you're holding together. You feel replaceable despite everything you've given. And the worst part isn't that she changed. It's that you did. You became smaller to keep things stable. And stability purchased at the cost of self-respect never lasts. It only delays the moment you realize you've been disappearing in slow motion. Reframing sacrifice doesn't start with action. It starts with perception. Sacrifice must be voluntary, not demanded. The moment it's expected, scheduled, or emotionally coerced, it stops being love and becomes extraction. Love responds to choice. Extraction relies on obligation. When you feel pressure to give rather than a decision to give, something fundamental has already shifted. And most men miss this because they've been trained to see pressure as responsibility instead of warning. The second awareness cuts deeper because it removes every comforting illusion. Reciprocity is the only measure. Not intention, not history, not potential. Effort answered with effort. Respect answered with respect. Anything else is imbalance disguised as patience. Reciprocity doesn't mean keeping score, it means direction. When your giving creates mutual movement, you're investing. When your giving creates comfort without return, you're being consumed. And consumption doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It presents itself as need. Men resist this awareness because it forces them to stop romanticizing their own endurance. You want to believe that love is proven by how much you can absorb. But absorption doesn't inspire reciprocity, it removes urgency. When there's no cost to taking from you, taking becomes normal. and normal becomes invisible. This is why reframing sacrifice isn't about giving less. It's about noticing what your giving produces. The final awareness is the one men fight hardest because it threatens their sense of morality. Your capacity to leave is part of your value, not because leaving is power, but because choice is. A man who can't walk away can't be chosen. He can only be relied upon. And reliance without choice is not desire. It's utility. When staying is your only option, your presence loses meaning. When leaving is possible, staying becomes significant. This doesn't mean you threaten or posture. It means you maintain an internal line you won't cross. You don't announce it. You live it. You stop sacrificing yourself to preserve access. You stop offering more to compensate for less. You let reciprocity, or the lack of it, reveal the truth without argument. Reframing sacrifice restores your center. You stop proving worth through depletion. You stop confusing endurance with devotion. And when you do that, something changes quietly but decisively. You no longer give because you're afraid to lose. You give because you choose to. And only from that position does sacrifice mean anything at all, and at the end of all this, the truth doesn't arrive as rage or blame. It lands quietly, with the weight of recognition. Some women meet sacrifice with gratitude and growth. They see what's being given and respond with care, restraint, and reciprocity. Others don't. Others consume it without conscience, not because they're evil, but because you taught them they could. And once sacrifice becomes invisible, it stops being love and starts being fuel. Here is the line men were never meant to hear, but desperately need. To you were never meant to bleed endlessly to prove your worth. Love is not a courtroom where suffering earns a verdict. You don't become valuable by how much of yourself you're willing to lose. Worth is not extracted through endurance. It's recognized through reciprocity. And when recognition disappears, sacrifice becomes self-harm disguised as virtue. Your responsibility isn't to save someone who benefits from your erosion. It isn't to carry imbalance indefinitely just to keep the structure intact. It isn't to confuse loyalty with self-abandonment. The man who sacrifices everything eventually has nothing left to offer, no presence, no polarity, no self-respect. And when that happens, the relationship doesn't deepen, it hollows out. This is the calm most men never reach because they mistake pain for purpose. You don't need to hate her to stop betraying yourself. You don't need to rewrite the past to justify choosing differently now. You only need the clarity to see when sacrifice has crossed the line from choice into obligation, from love into fear. That clarity doesn't make you cruel. It makes you whole. The final truth is simple, and that's why it's hard to accept. It's not your job to be endlessly consumed. It's your job to know when giving has turned into self-betrayal, and to stop calling it love. If this feels uncomfortable, it's because it's true. Subscribe. We talk about the truths men were trained not to question.